Welcome to the Lensic, Santa Fe's Performing Arts Center. On behalf of the theater and the person seated next to you, we ask that you take a moment to please silence your cell phones and pagers. Thank you.
Welcome to the Lensic, to Readings and Conversations, a place that I relish coming to a couple of times a year for the last, I think, 15 years. And it's a pleasure to be here, especially, well, because of the wonderful Lannan Foundation, without whom, let me just say. You know how I'd finish that sentence. Without whom nothing. I'm also thrilled because Alice McDermott, you know I'm Michael Silverblatt, yes? Okay. Alice McDermott is one of my very, very favorite writers. We've spoken to one another many times before, and many writers will tell you, frankly, that they don't know anything about their writing, that it's an unconscious process. They're afraid of talking about it too consciously for fear that they'll lose the mystery. Joan Didion, for instance, is one who does not talk about her writing, not with any pleasure, not with any calm. But Alice astonishes me with the things that she can say about her writing. I always come away, most of the time writers say to me, "Oh, I've learned so many things about what I do from you," and I feel very happy, but I learn about what Alice does from Alice. She really is an extraordinarily gifted and canny writer, and she teaches her students to write with intention. That is to say, no nonsense. Why is that coat blue? Why are those socks polka-dotted? You'd better have a reason why you're working with me, and I'm going to teach you how to make your writing more resonant and more resonant still. It's just astounding. In her last book, this is her most recent one called Someone. It came out last year, but in her last book, which was called After This, a young boy, young from an Irish family, that goes without saying with Alice McDermott, a young boy from an Irish family has come home with a picture of the constellations from his elementary school, and of course, the constellation we know as Orion is spelled O''Ryan. It may be an old joke, but I was thinking that is what Alice McDermott does. She connects the Irish family on the earth to the Ireland in the universe. She connects the particular with the universal. Her work is filled with camouflaged saints and angels, she told me last night, and comedians. We'll find out more about that. And it's because these are the figures of grace. I sometimes cry the hottest tears. I cry when I'm reading her because she's so clear-eyed, and then at the same time, she can be so heartbreakingly, it's that cheap Irish music. You know, it makes you weep. I'm so thrilled. Alice is also going to read a brand new thing as well as a section of this most recent novel, Someone. It will be the best night you've had in many and many and many a night, I promise. Thank you.
Well, I'm going home now. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you to the Lannans for inviting me for my first trip to Santa Fe. I hope it will not be the last. And yesterday, not so much, but today you gave me those beautiful Georgia O'Keeffe skies, what I was hoping to see. As Michael said, I'm going to read from something that's more or less brand new. Since you were all generous enough to come out tonight, I always feel that something should happen at a reading that can't happen when you're home reading the book by yourself. So this is a very short story. I don't write a lot of short stories, and most of the short stories I've written have been, surprisingly enough, assignments. It lets me feel like a journalist, you know, like one of those writers that really has to stick to deadlines. I've never met a deadline I couldn't break, but the Washington Post magazine during the holidays for the past few years has published 3 short stories, one for Thanksgiving, one for the Christmas and Hanukkah season, and then one for New Year's Eve. And they called me this year and said, you have your choice. You can, if you would write a short story for the magazine, you will be the first one to choose, so you can choose which of the 3. Well, I've written an on-assignment Christmas story for the New York Times. I didn't tell them that, you know, they don't like you to write for the New York Times if you're going to write for the Washington Post. So I said, oh, maybe not Christmas. New Year's, I thought, well, that's probably the richest dramatic holiday. But the story is going to be confined somehow to the ticking of the clock, you know, and I don't want to be confined to the something's going to happen at midnight if you're writing a story about, and even just thinking about a story where something happens on midnight on New Year's Eve was boring me, and I hadn't written the first. So I chose probably the dullest and the most unlikely holiday to write a short story about, and that was Thanksgiving. So since you probably don't all run out and read the Washington Post magazine on a Sunday, here's the story for you that you might not otherwise see. The title of the story is Gloria. Richard should have said lucky. He had intended to say lucky. This was a toast, after all, not a benediction. His family had dispensed with saying grace before Thanksgiving dinner long ago. No one among them was religious anymore. He and Ellie, his wife, had happily drifted away from Sunday obligations as soon as their 3 children outgrew whatever benefits the various local churches once offered. Nursery school at Hamilton United Methodist, aftercare at St. Monica's, Third Presbyterian's youth group. They had even comfortably slipped out from under the hypocrisy of showing up on Christmas and Easter. Too many competing interests to balance as the kids went off to college, started their careers, began families of their own. So much happy busyness on those holidays, presents, egg hunts, an elaborate brunch in some beautiful place, that they were able to abandon the solemn hour at the beginning of it all without regret, without much conversation. They were a happy family. His children and their children were thriving. Their home was beautiful. 6 bedrooms on a sylvan 1.5 acres just inside the Beltway, a house that filled him with astonished pride each time he pulled into his own circular drive, a house that was, at the moment, made more beautiful still by the Thanksgiving table with its fruits and flowers and pale linen, the good silverware, Ellie's grandmother's, and the Waterford crystal, bought on their honeymoon 40 years ago and winking like starlight. And before him, as he stood to make his toast, the beloved faces of his 3 grown children, 2 attorneys and a university professor, his 4 handsome, healthy grandchildren, a jovial son-in-law who made plenty of money, a daughter-in-law who was both a terrific mother and a terrific pediatrician, and this year, new to them, lovely Gloria, their younger son's fiancée. Ryan had met her only last August. They would be married after Christmas. She, too, was an attorney. She was a few years older than their son, 36 to his 31, but that was no matter. Gloria was stunning, poised and funny and smart. She owned both a condo downtown and a country house in Vermont. And it was perhaps her pretty face and her warm smile, her shoulder comfortably touching Ryan's as they all looked up to Richard when he rose to give the Thanksgiving toast, that made him say at the end of it, at the end of his sentimental and, yes, why not, self-congratulatory enumeration of their many talents, triumphs, joys, "We are truly blessed," when what he had meant to say was lucky. It was only in recollection that he felt, as soon as he uttered the word, a shaft of cold air, as if a small pane of glass in the mullioned window at the end of the elegant room had been punched out by an invisible hand. In reality, there was a certain rolling of the eyes among them as they touched their glasses together, muttering indulgent and ironic things like, "Amen to that," and "Hallelujah, brother." As he sat down again, Matt, his older son, said, "Thank you, Ned Flanders," and Annie, his daughter-in-law, said, "It was a lovely toast, Dad, very sweet." "Very Little House on the Prairie," Jill, his own daughter, added. And they all laughed and then tried to remember the name of the actor who played the patriarch on the show, which Richard came up with before the others pulled out their phones, thus restoring his authority. And then the dinner proceeded as it always did. It wasn't until the pause between dinner and dessert, when they were finishing off the wine, when the grandchildren had been released to the family room, the table briefly cleared and the lights turned down, aids digestion, Ellie claimed, so that it was candlelight alone lighting their faces, that the word came up again. They were talking about a ski trip this winter. Gloria was offering her place in Vermont, which she said could comfortably sleep the 12 of them. "You should see it," Ryan said. 5 acres with its own pond. Back of the house is all glass, incredible views. "How long have you had it?" Richard asked her, and Gloria said, 7 years now. "I bought it when I sold my parents' house in McLean." "Wow," Annie said, "you were young." And Gloria shrugged, smiling. She had beautiful teeth, a regal forehead, a single dimple in her cheek. Richard tried to recall her biography. Ryan had brought home so many pretty girls over the years that it was sometimes hard to keep them all straight. Gloria had lost both her parents when she was still in her 20s. Richard remembered joking with his son about the advantages of having no in-laws. No siblings, apparently. Her father had been what, a doctor, a banker? "What was it your father did?" he asked her. "He was an attorney," she said modestly, bowing her head. It was a silly notion. Richard would have been the first to admit it, but something about her beauty made him suspect that her father had been a successful attorney, a partner, no doubt. "He retired early," she said, "when my mother got sick." "Alzheimer's," Ryan informed the rest of them, speaking gently on her behalf. "Early onset. She was," he turned to her, "how old?" 49, Gloria said. I was 13. Oh my, Ellie said sympathetically. How difficult for you. Terrible disease, Richard said, aware of and making an effort to resist a certain recoil of his heart. Wasn't early onset indicative of a genetic link? Hadn't he read that somewhere? What kind of future did that bode for his son? Must have been rough for your dad, he added. Gloria turned to him, pushing the pretty hair over her shoulder. Ryan had draped his arm along the back of her chair. It killed him, she said. Richard glanced down the table to his wife. Ever gracious, Ellie whispered, I can imagine. But the girl shook her head. No, literally. He took early retirement. He devoted himself to her. He hired caregivers when I was still in high school so he could go to my games, take me on the college tour. But after I left for Penn, he took care of her himself. He couldn't bear the way anyone else treated her or talked to her, anyone who hadn't known her before when she was well. So he took care of her all by himself. Everyone told him not to, but he did. She bowed her head again, the hair falling forward. I was in my junior year, just before spring break, when he died. Heart attack. A neighbor found him in the kitchen. Apparently, he had been making my mother's breakfast. We guessed that the last thing he did was turn off the gas under the frying pan. The eggs were just half cooked. He must have felt it coming on. It was nearly noon when the neighbor stopped by. My mother had been bathed. Her hair was combed and tied back the way she liked it, even some lipstick. The neighbor had to knock on the window to get her to let him in. Ryan added, so Gloria quit school. She came home to take care of her mother. That couldn't have been easy, Annie said. Gloria shrugged. I couldn't give her to strangers either. The candlelight caught her blue eyes as she turned to Ellie. When I came home, I found that my mother had left all these little notes in the china cabinet, in the kitchen, in the linen closet. She must have started writing them when she first got sick, when she knew things were slipping away. Little instructions, mostly for the holidays, like, this is the tablecloth I use for Easter, or this is the best platter for serving the turkey, or best dishes for a large buffet, but hand wash them, things like that. I guess my father left the notes there for me to discover when the time came, almost as if he knew. And here her voice caught a little, as if he knew I'd be taking over for him. He must have been a wonderful man, Ellie whispered. Gloria nodded. Yes, he was, she said, matter-of-factly. A good man, kind. For years, before my mother got sick, he taught English as a second language at a little church in D.C. He joined the Peace Corps out of college. My mother did too. That's where they met. They wanted to have a pack of kids, but things didn't work out. My mother lost 4 babies before she had me. She had been slouching a bit, Ryan's arm draped across the back of the chair. But now she drew herself up, placed her hands on the table, straightening her shoulders and setting her mouth in a way that made the girlish dimple vanish. I wish I were as kind as he was, she said evenly, but I'm not. Her voice grew professional. A billable hours voice, it occurred to Richard later. So I have to say that I don't understand people who think they have been blessed, that God somehow favors them because they're good people or they worked hard. My parents were good people who worked hard. They deserved to grow old together, to see their grandchildren. She looked down at Ryan's hand as he placed it over hers, not to stop her, it was clear, but to show his solidarity. But I guess we weren't blessed the way you guys are, by whoever it is who does the blessing. A whispered chorus of polite, conciliatory replies rose up around the table. Oh, now, Ellie murmured from the far end. Whoever is right, Annie offered agreeably. Matt said on his father's behalf, "It's just a manner of speaking." And his son-in-law added, "It was just a toast." But Jill was nodding. "I completely understand what she's saying." And Ryan, grasping his future wife's hand, declared them all maybe just a bit too self-satisfied about their own good fortune, too oblivious of the troubles of others. "You did sound kind of smug," he told his father. Just then, the grandchildren returned to the dining room, moving as they did in those days in a chattering scrum. They wanted their sweets. They wanted pumpkin pie and whipped cream and the special caramels Ryan brought down from Baltimore. Courtney, the youngest, climbed easily into Richard's lap. She was blonde and angel-faced, a replica of Jill at that age, the weight of her an embodied memory of that happy time in his life when he had been a young father. Yet another happy time. The noise of family life returned to the room, the children making their demands, and Ellie standing, herding them into the kitchen, Annie and Jill standing as well. "Who wants decaf?" Matt following to fetch the brandy. Gloria asked, "How can I help?" And the girls waved their hands. Sit, finish your wine." "You misunderstood me," Richard wanted to say, but the conversation had moved on. Courtney was pressing her little body against his chest, puffing at the nearest candle from the comfortable distance of just under his chin. She reached up to put her small hand to his cheek. "You help, Grandpa," she said. "Do you think I can do it?" he asked her, and she said, "Charming child, certainly you can." He glanced only briefly at Gloria as he leaned forward over the child's head. She was watching them both, smiling. The dimple was back, but with a certain arrogance, he thought, as if her sorrow had made her prescient, as if she saw the end of his luck somewhere, if not in his own fortunate life, then in his children's children, as if she understood, but he did not, that it would take no more than a breath, a loosened blood clot, a bad gene, the cold work of some invisible hand striking unexpectedly from out of the darkness to put an end to it all, his happiness, his complacency, his many blessings. He leaned over the child's head and blew out the candle. Courtney clapped her hands. He had intended to say lucky, even to rap his knuckles on the table as he spoke, but he said blessed instead. Looking back, he thought he might have added, "Have mercy on us," just to make himself clear. But it was a toast he had stood to offer, a Thanksgiving toast. No one had asked him for a prayer. Thank you. So happy Thanksgiving. Sort of. And this section that I'm going to read from the novel From Someone is pretty much, doesn't need too much explanation. Someone is the story of one single woman's life, Marie Comerford, who we see first at 7 and sort of follow into the end of her life in her old age. She's a woman who comes of age through the 20th century. She lives in Brooklyn, child of, everyone at some point lives in Brooklyn. She is the child of Irish immigrants, working class Brooklyn, early in the 20th century. In this section, she's about to be a young mother. Tom is her husband. She's lost her father as a teenager. Gabe, her older brother, who is the perfect son for Irish parents because he is handsome, he recites poetry, and he went into the priesthood early. Unfortunately, Gabe has since returned from the priesthood, which in some ways is even better because now he's home taking care of his widowed mother, so that's kind of why you want kids in the priesthood, so they'll come home and take care of their widowed mothers. So I think that's all you need to know. And so it begins. The doctor was red-faced. His hands were abrupt. "Mrs. Comerford," he said, "you are not cooperating." Although I could not see it, I knew there must have been perspiration beaded on his forehead, because as he leaned to shout at me, a drop of it hit the sheet beneath my chin. I didn't see it fall, but somehow I heard the sound it made, and in my pain, I imagined that out of that sound, the sound of a raindrop on a dry roof, there rose more profoundly the scent of the hospital laundry, the scent of bleach on the sheet that nearly reminded me, too, of some experience in this life that I might have liked, might have loved even, my first night with Tom under sheets that had not been dried in the sun or on a line in my mother's kitchen. But the pain was a swelling black tide that engulfed the brief, bright recollection in the same way it began to absorb the doctor's red face and the hovering nurses in white and the light in the room, daylight or electric. Who could say? I had been in labor for hours and hours by then, days perhaps. I had not understood. I had not been told the extent of the suffering involved. From the cramps of the enema to the scrape of the razor to the endless searing rise and the long aching fall of each contraction. I had sent so many entreaties to heaven by then, first that my baby would be healthy, then that I would please not die, now only that the pain might end, that I had begun to see myself as some kind of fuller brush salesman knocking on a solid door, a door without hinges, without knobs. Hours, days, could it be weeks into this ordeal? I had given up the hope of getting an answer, and so turned my pleas instead to my own father, who had loved me and would have wept to see me here, trussed up like a beast in a slaughterhouse, trapped under the weight of my belly, racked with pain, and now, among so many indignities, this man, this doctor, shouting angrily into my face, "I am cooperating," I managed to say, and wanted to add something shocking and bitter and profane. But the black tide was surging across memory, too. I couldn't reach the words I wanted. "You bastard, you son of a bitch, you Amadon, you damn fool." There was, somewhere beside my ear, a hiss of air. The white nurse leaned in. She held in her hand the rubber mask, offering the ether, but the doctor brushed her away with a wave of his hand. She seemed to disappear into the light. "Oh, please," I heard my own voice, not roaring out those curse words as I had imagined, but pleading, whimpering, and thin. The man leaned down again. This was not my own doctor, but one I recalled brought in sometime in the last few hours or days, red-faced, imperious, with abrupt, impatient hands. "A little pain now," he said, "for a good outcome later, for your baby, a good outcome." A bitter drop of his perspiration fell on my lip, and then he leaned across me, and his white chest absorbed like cotton the black wash of my pain. He was going to smother me. The only antidote, of course, for my suffering. Fool that I had been to think otherwise. No other relief but dying, letting go of this poor body at last, sloughing it off, a shell, a doll. They could stuff it with horsehair. I would make no more entreaties. I would fall effortlessly against the solid and unyielding door. They tore me in two. Later, making a joke of it, I said I was run over by the Coney Island Express. The parameters of the pain, from breast to thigh, just about the distance between the black steel of the subway tracks. The odor of blood that filled the crowded room like the underground scent of hollowed rock and cold steel. I heard, in fact, the walloping, beating rhythm of passing subway cars, just as the red-faced doctor sliced me apart without sufficient anesthesia, without without any at all, I was certain, and pulled the baby out and sewed me up again so that I felt every stitch, pain like the walloping beat, light and dark and pounding air of a passing train, steel against bitter steel, a train passing over me, cracking my hip bones and rattling the teeth in my china skull. Unnecessarily withheld, 2 of the nurses said later, as they bathed me and changed my dressing and returned my limp body, still mine, it seemed, to a bed on the ward. They spoke softly, looking over their shoulders to the door and the hallway outside. He had his training in the army, they told me. He had a bad war. Cruel, they said of him. Brutal, they said. They said, he thinks women need to be more stoic about these things. But when the doctor came into the room again, they only smiled and bowed and then scattered like pigeons when he shouted his demands. I saw my mother in a chair by the window. When I opened my eyes again, my mother wore her hat and her pale broadcloth summer suit, and she held her purse on her lap. The slatted sunlight had washed her of all color. I thought for a moment that we might both have died during the long days and nights of my ordeal, not because of the pale light in the blank room, but because of the sweet assurance I felt, waking and seeing my mother there, that I was loved, cherished beyond all reason. The peace of this, the stillness of the room, the temporary suspension of pain seemed evidence enough that I had come to the end of time. I felt a strange elation, and then I closed my eyes and slept again. It was evening, and the light was low, and Tom was in the chair when I next opened them. And then a parched morning, the sound of trays and rolling bassinets and babies crying here and there, the sound of the nurse's voice as she leaned over me, all of it furred and fiery. I had an unshakable image of red flocked wallpaper growing like fungus over my tongue and down my throat. They threw whatever covered me aside, but there was no relief in the chill I now felt on my damp skin. The wide bandages were ripped from what was left of the poor, pale flesh suspended between the thin bones of my hips. There was the sweet, pungent odor of pus. There were barked orders from the military doctor, or perhaps this was another one, more indifferent hands running over my flesh. No indignity in it anymore. I had grown so accustomed to it now. A broad nurse with gold curls beneath her cap washed my naked body with a large sponge, running the thing up and down over my extended arm, extended because the nurse had lifted my hand and clamped it under her own armpit in the casually efficient way a busy woman hanging clothes holds a clothespin in her mouth. She ran the sponge up over my shoulders and between my breasts. The nurse wore a damp apron over her uniform, and her fat arms were as cool and solid as gray marble. There was the faint smell of vinegar in the air. Later, I heard my mother's voice raised in anger, but had no strength to assure her that there was no need to object. A body, after all, was a paltry thing, and really, Mama, all modesty had long ago gone out the window. And then there were murmured prayers. A bald priest in a black cassock and a green and gold stole with a missal in one hand and the other reaching for the small container my brother Gabe held out to him in his cupped palm. Gabe, too, in a pale suit, standing at the dark priest's elbow, but presiding somehow, elegant and assured nonetheless. I focused on Gabe's hands, his beautiful hands, and then I felt the flesh of the priest's thumb against my forehead and my palms, and then someone fumbled with the blanket at my feet, and I whispered, or so I was later told, "Oh, honestly." It was Tom who laughed then. I knew him by his laughter. Later, he put his dry lips to my cheek and held them there. "Please," he said, later still. "A beautiful boy," he said, and kissed me again. He said, "You're doing fine," and another time, "Home soon." I heard the loud-mouthed doctor say, "Built like a child to begin with," and kept my eyes closed, pretending to sleep. Then another morning, and when the doctor came in, I was sitting up in the bed and had just finished a light breakfast. He folded the blanket down to my thighs to examine my incision, but this time with a polite caution I had not seen before. He even said, "If I may." He touched the bandages with his fingertips. It occurred to me that I had become accustomed to looking down across my body to find his head hovering there. I knew his bald spot as well as I knew Tom's. He said, "That's fine, much better," and then quickly, almost shyly, covered me again. He was, I thought, giving my body back to me. I felt a peculiar regret, the end of some intimacy. He put his hand on my forearm. He was red-faced and gray-haired and strong-jawed. He looked like an old general. Someone had told me that he'd had a bad war, brutal. "Don't have any more children," he said, and then turned to the nurse in the doorway. "Bring this little mother her boy." At home, it was agreed that I would go back to my mother's house until I was fully recovered. My mother said, "There is the ring. There is the sheath. You can take your temperature every morning and keep a record. You can sleep in separate beds." The baby, little Tommy, was plump and healthy, alive in my arms, and he woke every 3 hours. Once again, my mother and I were sharing the big bed. My mother was up at the child's first whimper, always the warm bottle of formula at the ready. The ordeal that had almost killed me was reduced now to the hot red incision that split my belly, so jagged and roughly sewn that my mother, seeing it, had whispered, "I'd like to wring his neck." If I moved the wrong way, the pain from it would flare across my entire midsection, make me stoop to catch my breath. Tom came to the apartment after work and had dinner with us, usually with the baby in his arms, and then sat in the living room holding my hand, chatting and chatting in his cheerful way, only reluctantly lifting his hat and kissing us both goodbye when I got up to go to bed. I followed him to the door. I was still to avoid stairs, but more often than not, Gabe walked him to his car. Gabe said, in the first days of this routine, he did it because Tom seemed such a lonely soul, going back alone to our apartment in Queens. But I began to suspect my brother had another intention in accompanying poor Tom down the stairs. There was the matter, after all, of the doctor's injunction. I must not have another child. When we were alone in the apartment, my mother said, "There is the ring. There was once a woman who lived on Jeralaman Street above the Shahab's bakery who you could go to for the thing. But the right doctor could tell you as well. There is the sheath, if Tom will oblige. You can take your temperature every morning and keep a record. You can sleep in separate beds or separate rooms, and if he comes to you in the night, you can say," and here she lifted her nose into the air, "And who'll raise this baby when I'm dead?" You can sleep with a soup spoon under your pillow and give him a whack with the back of it. I don't have to tell you where, which got us laughing like girls. My mother knew things she had never spoken of before. On a Saturday, I'm going to finish. On a Saturday in cool October, 2 months after my ordeal, Tom put the bassinet and my suitcase into the trunk of the car, tying the lid half closed with rough string. He was giddy, going in and out in his good overcoat. My mother went before us down the stairs with a shopping bag full of the meals she had cooked. Gabe was behind us with the baby in his arms. Tom put one arm around my waist and gripped my right hand with the other as I leaned against the banister, taking one step at a time at his insistence. "I'm really fine," I said, although the cold air and the sunlight on the sidewalk made my head swim. He eased me into the front seat of the car, only a twinge in my abdomen as I sat, an echo of the insult. Gabe leaned down to place the baby in my arms. As Tom and I pulled away from the curb, I waved to the two of them, my mother and my brother. They were standing on the sidewalk together, my mother looking very small beside him, Gabe as handsome as ever. I knew they would watch until the car rounded the corner, and then they would go up again together to finish out the suddenly quiet day. At the apartment in Rego Park, all was spick and span and lemon polish and the lingering odor of the apple pie Tom had taught himself to bake that morning, only the beginning of his efforts to make up for a wife who would not learn to cook. There were roses in a vase on the table in the small kitchen. The crib was ready in the single bedroom, and our bed was crisply made. He carried up the bassinet and the bottles and the shopping bag of food while I changed the baby's diaper and fed him a bottle and put him into his crib. Then Tom made tea and cut 2 pieces of the pie. I admired the roses while we ate at the small table. Tom told a funny story about the 2 ladies in the grocery store who had advised him about the best apples to choose. While the baby's asleep, I told him, I might go lie down. He brought my suitcase in, and I changed out of my dress and took off my stockings and put a house coat over my slip. I put my glasses on the bedside table. He smoothed down the bedspread for me and took a throw from the closet, all wordlessly, so as not to wake the sleeping child. He lowered the shades while I stretched out on the bed, and when he leaned down to kiss my forehead and whisper sweet dreams, I took his wrist and said, "You lie down too." He walked around the bed, sat at the edge, and untied his shoes. He lay back somewhat cautiously, I thought, and with as much distance between us as there could possibly be in a double bed, reached over and took my hand. He gripped it briefly, to assure himself that I was there perhaps, or maybe simply to convey that he was grateful for the assurance. I heard him sigh and knew without turning my head he had closed his eyes. I lifted his hand and brought it to my lips. It was not that my life was less valuable to me now that I had glimpsed what it would be like to lose it. My love for the child asleep in the crib, the child's need for me, for my vigilance, had made my life valuable in a way that even the most abundantly offered love, my parents, my brothers, even Tom's, had failed to do. Love was required of me now, to be given, not merely to be sought and returned. My presence on earth was never more urgently needed, and yet even the certainty of that fact seemed reason to throw away caution, not to heed it. I kissed his hand and moved it to my heart. We turned to each other. "Oh, Marie," he whispered, "we have to be careful." "Why?" I asked. And I saw that he couldn't resist a smile at my answer. I was a bold piece. He made his eyes and his mouth grow serious. "You can't endure another child." "Who said?" I whispered. He shook his head. I still held his hand against my heart. "Your doctor," he said, "your brother, even the priest who came to the hospital, who gave you last rites." "Fools," I said. "Which one of them has ever had a baby?" But Tom closed his eyes and put his hand to his forehead. "What a terrible night that was," he said. He whispered, "They gave you last rites," as if the memory of it still took his breath away. Gently, I touched his cheek to make him see me. I squinted in an effort to see him. "It was only the silly infection," I said, and moved closer. I felt the ache in my abdomen, the muscles closing up around the ragged scar. "Next time, I'll know better," I said. "I'll bring my own ether." I began to unbutton his shirt. Everyone says the second baby's easier. Put my lips to his bared throat. Was there any place on a body more lonely and vulnerable? "A girl next time," I said. "One of the nurses told me to have a girl next time, someone to take care of me in my old age." But he was still shaking his head. "I'm not afraid," I told him. I wasn't. I had conceived our first child without any notion of the suffering involved. Now that I knew, desire, which was still there, of course, seemed small enough incentive to conceive again. It was courage now that was delightful to me. I was a bold piece. I had stood at death's door. I had withstood pain. I knew I could make a stand against it, against time, bold and stubborn, a living child in my arms. When he ran his fingertips over the scar that split my belly, he paused. I heard him catch his breath. "This is foolish of us," he whispered. I said, "I suppose it is." Thank you.